Imagine waking up every single day inside your own home, unable to walk to your mailbox, unable to sit through a single meal without crushing fatigue pulling you back to bed, watching 2 entire years of your life disappear while doctor after doctor told you your labs looked fine. That was reality for one woman whose story I'm about to share with you today. A story of being completely housebound for 2 years, written off by conventional medicine, and ultimately finding her way back to health through a combination of persistence, deeper testing, and a complete overhaul of how she approached her own body. Her journey isn't a miracle cure, and I want to be upfront about that from the start. But it is a genuinely powerful example of what's possible when someone refuses to accept that feeling unwell is simply something they have to live with. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what she went through, what actually helped her heal, and what pieces of her story might apply to your own situation. Welcome back to VitaRoot Health, the channel where we dig into real stories of chronic illness and recovery, always paired with the actual science behind what's happening in the body, so you walk away with information you can genuinely use. If you've ever felt dismissed by a doctor, told your tests are normal despite feeling anything but normal, or found yourself desperately searching for answers that never seem to come, this channel exists for exactly that moment in your life. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into today's story, because there's a lot here worth unpacking. Her story began the way so many autoimmune journeys begin, quietly and easy to dismiss. It started with what felt like ordinary exhaustion, the kind most people chalk up to a demanding job or simply not sleeping enough. But over the following months, that tiredness deepened into something entirely different, a fatigue so severe that getting out of bed felt like an athletic event. Joint pain crept in next, moving from one part of her body to another in a pattern that made no obvious sense. Then came the brain fog, a mental cloudiness so thick that she described struggling to hold a simple conversation or remember what she'd walked into a room to do. Digestive problems followed, along with skin rashes that would flare without warning and disappear just as mysteriously. Like so many people navigating unexplained chronic illness, she did exactly what she was supposed to do. She went to her doctor, she had blood drawn, and time after time, the results came back within what's considered a normal range. This is one of the most frustrating and disorienting parts of the autoimmune journey for so many people, because standard blood panels are often designed to catch obvious, severe abnormalities, not the subtler immune dysregulation that can be actively making someone miserable while still technically falling inside a normal reference range. She was told in various ways that her symptoms were likely stress-related, that she should try to relax more, that perhaps she needed to see a therapist. Each dismissal added another layer of self-doubt on top of the physical symptoms she was already struggling to manage. Over roughly 18 months, her condition progressively worsened. What began as manageable fatigue evolved into something that made leaving her house nearly impossible. Sensory overwhelm became a serious issue, with bright lights and loud environments triggering symptom flares that could leave her bedridden for days afterward. Eventually, she made the difficult decision to essentially withdraw from normal life, becoming housebound for a period that stretched to 2 full years. She missed family gatherings, watched friendships fade from lack of contact, and lost her ability to work, all while continuing to be told that nothing was seriously wrong with her. The turning point in her story came when she found a practitioner willing to look beyond standard testing. This is a theme that comes up again and again in stories like hers, and it's worth pausing on. Functional medicine practitioners, integrative doctors, and certain specialists who focus specifically on complex chronic illness often use a broader panel of testing than what's typically ordered in a standard primary care visit. In her case, this included more specific autoimmune antibody panels, comprehensive thyroid testing that went beyond the basic screening most doctors order, testing for nutrient deficiencies that are common in autoimmune conditions, and an evaluation of her gut health, given how closely intertwined the digestive system is with immune function. Through this more thorough investigation, she was eventually diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, one in which her immune system had begun mistakenly attacking her own healthy tissue. For context, autoimmune diseases as a category affect an enormous number of people, and conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and many others fall under this broad umbrella. What makes autoimmune conditions particularly difficult to diagnose is that symptoms often overlap heavily with other conditions, and the diagnostic process frequently requires ruling out numerous alternative explanations before arriving at a clear answer, a process that can understandably take years for many patients. Once she finally had a diagnosis, her healing journey shifted from a frustrating search for answers into an active, multi-pronged treatment approach. It's important to understand that her recovery wasn't the result of a single fix, but rather a combination of interventions working together, which is genuinely how most people manage to improve from complex autoimmune conditions. The first major piece of her recovery involved appropriate medical treatment for her specific diagnosis, working closely with her specialist to find the right therapeutic approach for her particular condition. This is a critical point I want to emphasize, because autoimmune conditions vary enormously in how they're treated, and what works for one person's specific diagnosis may not be appropriate for someone else, even if their symptoms look similar on the surface. Proper medical guidance from a qualified specialist remains the foundation of any real recovery from an autoimmune condition. Alongside her medical treatment, she made significant changes to her diet, working with a nutritionist to identify specific foods that seemed to be triggering inflammatory responses in her body. Many people with autoimmune conditions find that certain foods, commonly things like gluten, dairy, or highly processed foods, can exacerbate their symptoms, though the specific triggers vary considerably from person to person. Through a structured elimination and reintroduction process, she was able to identify her own personal triggers rather than following a generic diet plan, which research increasingly suggests is a more effective approach than one-size-fits-all dietary recommendations for autoimmune conditions. Gut health became another major focus of her recovery. Given how much of the immune system is actually housed in the digestive tract, addressing underlying gut imbalances is increasingly recognized as an important piece of managing autoimmune conditions. For her, this involved working to heal her gut lining, address an overgrowth of certain bacteria that had been identified through testing, and gradually reintroduce a more diverse range of fiber-rich foods to support a healthier microbiome over time. Stress management played a surprisingly large role in her healing as well, and this is a piece that's frequently underestimated. Chronic stress keeps cortisol elevated, and sustained high cortisol levels can actually worsen immune dysregulation, creating a difficult cycle where stress worsens symptoms and worsening symptoms create more stress. She incorporated daily practices like gentle meditation and eventually, as her strength slowly returned, extremely gentle movement, starting with just a few minutes of stretching and building up gradually over many months as her body allowed. Sleep optimization was another cornerstone of her approach. Given how much immune regulation and cellular repair happens during deep sleep, prioritizing consistent, quality rest became a non-negotiable part of her daily routine, even during the depths of her illness when sleep itself was often disrupted by pain and discomfort. I want to be really honest with you about the timeline here because so many recovery stories online gloss over how long and non-linear this process actually is. Her healing wasn't a straight line, and it wasn't fast. It took roughly a year of consistent treatment, dietary changes, and lifestyle adjustments before she noticed meaningful, sustained improvement. There were setbacks along the way, flare-ups that would knock her back down just as she started feeling stronger, moments of genuine discouragement where progress felt impossibly slow. This is simply the reality of managing a complex chronic condition, and I think it's important to share that honestly rather than presenting recovery as some kind of linear, guaranteed process. Eventually, though, the improvements began to accumulate. She was able to leave her house again, first for short periods, then gradually for longer stretches. Her fatigue, while never completely eliminated, became manageable in a way that allowed her to rebuild a version of her life that had felt entirely out of reach for 2 years. She returned to work in a modified capacity, reconnected with friends and family, and slowly rebuilt the parts of her life that her illness had taken from her. So what can you actually take away from a story like this if you're currently struggling with your own unexplained chronic symptoms? First, know that persistence in seeking answers matters enormously. If your standard testing keeps coming back normal, but you continue to feel unwell, it's absolutely reasonable to seek a second opinion or a referral to a specialist who can order more comprehensive testing. Second, understand that autoimmune conditions, and chronic illness more broadly, typically require a multi-pronged approach rather than a single fix, combining appropriate medical treatment with supportive lifestyle changes around diet, gut health, stress, and sleep. Third, and this is perhaps the most important point, healing from complex chronic illness is rarely linear, and setbacks along the way don't mean the overall trajectory isn't moving in the right direction. I also want to be very clear about something before we wrap up. This story is meant to be informative and hopefully encouraging, but it is not a substitute for professional medical guidance, and it's not a promise that the same approach will work identically for everyone. Autoimmune conditions vary enormously from person to person, and what worked for this particular case may not be appropriate for your specific diagnosis or circumstances. If you're dealing with symptoms like the ones described today, the right next step is always working with a qualified healthcare provider who can properly evaluate your individual situation and guide you toward an appropriate diagnostic and treatment plan. What I hope you take away from this story more than anything else is this simple truth. Feeling dismissed by the healthcare system doesn't mean nothing is actually wrong. It often simply means the right testing or the right specialist hasn't found you yet. If you're in the middle of your own search for answers right now, please don't give up on finding them because as difficult and exhausting as that search can be, real answers and real improvement genuinely are possible for so many people living with complex chronic conditions. That brings us to the end of today's story. If this resonated with you, or if it gave you language for something you've been experiencing yourself, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people who might be struggling in silence with the exact same thing. Drop a comment below and let me know if any part of this journey sounds familiar to your own experience. I read every single one, and your comments genuinely shape what we cover next on this channel. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to VitaRoot Health, because we'll keep bringing you real stories and real science to help you understand what might really be happening inside your body. Thank you so much for watching, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.